Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today. I'm going to leave a little bit of time for people to creep in, so the door will be slightly ajar. But thank you for joining. Today we're going to be talking about the fascinating topic of philanthropic funding. I know we're going to talk some numbers. It might be a little dry, but I hope to make it interesting later on, especially with our two panelists that we have here today. So I'm going to begin. Hello. You can see this face clearly matches mine. I'm Alejandro of the ReFed team. I'm on the Capital Innovation Engagement team, and my main focus is tracking where funding is going for the hope that I can share that information with all of you and then be able, guide you towards trying to reduce food waste through dollars. So before I dive into philanthropic funding, I do want to talk about the private funding that we've seen in the space, because I think that's going to provide context for what we're going to talk about later on. I think when you look at this slide, the main takeaway is you're seeing an acceleration of funding in the space. This probably echoes what Dana was saying today, in that maybe a couple of years ago, in 2016 actually, the space would have been considered a little more nascent, a little more early stage. But now we're seeing larger companies that are raising larger dollars. You're seeing higher valuations, and you're hearing the story about food waste in a lot more places. And as a result, you're getting a lot more funder attention too. I also don't want to skip the point that we've got year to date there. So that's 2023. I think everyone here is aware that with the current market backdrop and just like with inflation, almost like a market pullback, that it is a little tougher now to get funding from private sources. But despite that, food waste is still on track to, it looks like, be around 2020, 2022 levels, because we're halfway through the year, but we're already at 500 million. And so what we're here today to talk about is going to be the philanthropic data. We are going to be sneak peeking it today, but I think our goal is that we're going to be adding philanthropic data to our capital tracker this June, early June, so that information will be available for everyone here to use. If you are, let's say, someone who's going to be fundraising, you'll be able to see the capital tracker and see who in terms of philanthropy have been able to fund the space, and hopefully that's useful for you. In addition to that, you'll also be able to see where funding has gone, and we're hoping that's useful for, let's say, funders that are interested in the space. The reminder is June is when it'll be made available. Before I go further, there's a lot of caveats, so let me just say where we're sourcing the data is from 990 PF. So basically, this will be private foundation funding is what we've really focused on. The data itself is experiencing a 2-year lag, and that's just due to some budget cuts on the IRS's part. So our most complete data is going to be till 2020. On a rolling basis, we're going to keep it up to date. So I think the goal is we're already starting to get some 2021 and 2022 data. I'm not going to show it today because it's going to look really funky. So we're just going to look at the history first, and then we'll talk about the present with our panelists. We're also looking at grants that are a little less than, grants that are greater than 5,000. And so our focus there was so that we made sure that we wanted to look at the big dollars that are being spent in the space, but anything sub 5,000 is also more equivalent to individual giving, so we just wanted to focus our attention on that one area alone. And lastly, this is a big for everybody. The data is not going to be perfect. We are accessing just the 990s, so if you have any funding stories that you want featured on the capital tracker, send that data towards me, and I'll be happy to show it on the platform. In terms of how we're looking at tracking food waste funding, this is the concept of direct versus indirect. That's, I think, what we've rooted our analysis. And so what direct means is basically some sort of funding that could be directly attributable to reducing food surplus. And the way we determined that was basically the organization is solely focused on food waste, or in terms of a grant description, it was indicated that that grant was going towards reducing food waste in some way. And then there's this whole indirect piece. The indirect piece is going to be grants that we can't necessarily say are going to be reducing food waste. And what I would put in there is going to be funding for food banks, funding for food justice, funding for hunger relief. There's certain situations where the food may be purchased, and so it's hard to really strip out what is going to be reducing food waste versus what is being purchased. So that funding is being kept aside. That is not to say that we're not tracking it, because we do think that that is very important for the space too, but that our goal right now is we want to be able to present pure food waste funding that's going in the space, but also the funding that may be reducing food waste in some way, but we just want to keep them separate. And so without further ado, you'll recognize this chart was the chart that I showed a couple minutes ago, which was private funding. But now's the sneak peek for philanthropic funding. So you can see these little cool green bars. I thought this would look cooler in person, but there it is. But I don't want people here to take away the fact that these green bars are small. They are, but that is not the point of this slide. I think the point of this slide is that these green bars, which is basically philanthropic funding, are supporting the space in some way. Like if I were to look back in 2015 or 2016, the grants that are going there are to organizations that right now are generating a ton of revenue right now or raising larger rounds. So that's to say that this funding, although small, is mighty and helping catalyze the space. I know everyone here is going to hold me accountable if I don't show exact numbers. So here is what we're actually talking about, which is this is our preliminary findings for food waste funding that has been direct. So remember I talked about direct versus indirect. So this is the stuff that you could say directly went to either food waste orgs or food waste initiatives that is covered in the philanthropic lens. What I would take away from this slide is, again, you're seeing that steady growth. These are all minimums too, because as we get more data, this number will increase. But what I would say is that the run rate funding here is going to be around 20 million approximately that is going directly to food waste solutions, but it is increasing over time. You're also going to see a little bit of a drop-off, 2017 to 2018. That was because I think a lot of people in this room are aware that Rockefeller was very involved when it came to funding food waste solutions, like food waste in general, very early on. And now they're moving towards more international involvement. So that's what that drop-off is. This data is for just US food waste funding. And you'll notice 2020 is not here. That's another year that we have like partial data, but we would say that that is somewhat in line with 2019, especially given there was a lot of giving during the pandemic. Boop. And so going back to the point about indirect versus direct, if we're seeing that the run rate direct funding is around 20 million, and indirect is about 8 times that. So like when you think of indirect, that's all the food bank stuff, all the pantries. That's still a larger number than the direct, but it barely touches the surface of the funding need that's in the space right now. In terms of ReFed's modeling, we see the space needs about 1.4 billion in funding to reduce food waste by 50%. So it's not about like, let's say, Feeding America is getting all this funding and I'm not. It's more that we need more funding in the space to push these ideas to get to that 50% reduction goal. And you may be asking, where has funding been going? So we did a bit of a percentage mix here. So you can see, not surprisingly, a significant portion of grant funding and philanthropic funding went to what we define as rescue, so redistributing food that would have gone to waste. In addition to that, gleaning was another thing that got a lot of funding over the past, let's say, 5 years. It's weird, it does live in prevention from ReFed's classification, but I would say, like, if you were to think about this, call it 65% is going to what what the room here would define as rescue. And then there is the general piece. So general is, it's not a cop-out saying that we couldn't classify it, but more that these grants are going to be towards building the space. So WWF, NRDC, ReFed, like organizations that helped set the foundation for the food waste space so that other organizations like rescue and recycling could build from that. And research would also fall into here too. And lastly, we've got prevention and recycling. And the role that philanthropy played there is that it helped catalyze startups. So before even seeking, let's say, venture capital money, a lot of these startups got, let's say, a research grant or something that helped start the idea before it actually became a business. And again, just highlighting the fact prevention also, weirdly enough, lives in, or cleaners, weirdly enough, live in prevention, but I know a lot of people here would consider it a rescue solution. And so this is not a top 10 list. I don't want it to look like a top 10 list, but it's more as an idea of what organizations were funded over, let's say, that 5-year period. We saw a lot of concentration in a lot of these names. So again, the takeaway here is a lot of these are rescue organizations. We have a few, again, general organizations that help build the space, WWF, NRI, NRDC. And we also, of course, have 0.0, which made a food waste film. But those were sort of the ideas that were funded in 2019, or I guess 2015 to 2019. And then the most active funders. Again, this is on a dollar basis. And I don't want to say, like, again, this is not a top 10 list, like, good job, all of you. I think there's a lot of funders here who are actively funding the food waste space that we may not have been able to get tracked or may not have been able to track. And in addition to that, this is old data. We are aware that there are new funders that are more active in the space. We have a few right here who will talk a bit more. But that's just to say that these organizations are here. They've been very active. And the other point is we know that Rockefeller and Cluniel were active in the past, but they've also dropped off as, in terms of their grant giving, it's got like a set around 5 years, and then they move on to the next initiative, and they're now focusing on international. And so with that, I've talked enough, but I'm going to talk a little bit more. I do want to introduce our fellow panelists. I think that a lot of what I presented today is very, I would say, theoretical, just numbers, like I played around in a spreadsheet, but I'd much rather be able to tell the story of what is going on in funding. And so that's why we've got 2 panelists here today to be able to talk about their experiences, because they're very active. They speak to funders, and I think that they'll be able to lend a perspective beyond just a chart or the numbers. So with that, I'm going to introduce my fellow panelists. First, we have the honor of having Ida Posner here. She is very actively involved in the food waste space through the Posner Foundation, as well as investing in various food waste startups. So really excited to have her here. She'll also probably talk about the grant initiative that she had in 2022, funding consumer food waste initiatives. And we also have Cyrus here, who is a co-head of impact investing at Arabella Advisors, as well as a very active impact investor, and has been very involved in speaking to other funders and really working with trying to marry private and philanthropic capital, which I think like we actually have like a pretty good connection on that. And so with that, let's begin. So I was up there talking about trends and everything, and I would love for both of you to sort of fill the gaps. What has happened? What have you seen after those periods? So 2020, 2021, 2022. And I'll ask this first of Cyrus. What have you been seeing in the space so far in terms of funding?
Specifically in food waste?
Let's go with food waste, yeah.
So I think I would sort of put that time period in 2 phases. There's sort of the last year-ish and then the first year and a half, 2 years. From 2020 to until maybe the first quarter of last year, I would say generally the impact investing space and I focus mostly on regenerative ag, and we put food waste as kind of an adjacent category there, to be quite active. Fundraising was obviously an arduous journey for entrepreneurs, but there was a fairly clean roadmap there. There was plenty of private capital on the sideline that was actively looking to be deployed. That significantly changed last year, and we've seen a pretty significant pullback from investors, and most entrepreneurs that I've spoken to over the last maybe year and a half have shifted their strategy to sort of, instead of trying to raise priced rounds, maybe bridge rounds to get to a place that feels more comfortable. I would say that in contrast to the flow of dollars that we've seen, you still see plenty of foundation clients, and most of my clients are foundations, trying to signal that the sort of interest is still there, the desire is still there, but there's certainly been an extra level of maybe scrutiny and an air of hesitancy to deploy as confidently as they did maybe 2 years ago.
Okay, that makes sense. And Ida, from your perspective, I would ask similarly, like, what is the sense for funding food waste over these past couple of years, and where have you seen like ideas and funding going?
So we've been funding in this space for a while, and I think, when you're looking at the data, which is great that we have this now, we did a strategic plan a couple years ago to think about, okay, we've been looking at food waste as an issue for a while. We've been funding the groups that, if you were to Google, who do I fund for food waste, right? Like, that's the stuff that's going to come up. Not that that's what we did. But we wanted to go a step beyond the kind of immediate first things you would think of in this space. So we did a strategic plan, and that led us kind of to what your data showed, that the ends of the barbell, so prevention and recycling, there was really a funding gap there. And we decided initially to start to tackle the prevention side, partially because that really is a sweet spot for philanthropy. It's a little harder to make that case in the for-profit investment world. The ROI is a little harder to prove. It's a longer-term behavior change, and the results, you might not see them for a while, and they're just kind of harder to track. This dollar yielded that result. And that's what led us to launching our RFP last year on reshaping consumer environments, which we used ReFed's framework to use, and that was really helpful for us. And I think an interesting thing in that experience was the really broad range of applications we got. And, we definitely placed those into certain buckets. We got a lot of interest, in K-12, a lot on consumer education campaigns. But what we found was really exciting was that bucket of what you defined as indirect solutions. And so groups that really weren't working on food waste specifically, but food waste was a potential impact outcome for their work and a theme they could weave into an existing project. And I think that, just being here today and hearing all of the different sessions and everything, that is such a major theme of what we need to do, which is to bring in new players who might not be hyper-focused on food waste, but can approach it from a different angle and do a good job of storytelling so that we can get more funding to this space. Because, and this is a long way of saying, it's tough to get more funding. And if I had, an answer as to exactly why that is, I'd love to share that with everyone. I think it's a super compelling story, but I think that we have to think about how we tell that story in 20 different ways, because everyone's going to receive it differently. But we're certainly seeing a huge amount of opportunity and organizations that really have good ideas on how we can start to make progress in ways that might not be as traditional as how we've thought about food waste in the past.
And that makes sense, like, from my perspective, too. I think a lot of people here are aware that ReFed also did a consumer-focused LOI, like, last year, and we granted out funding this year. And so that's the other thing that I think, like, doesn't show up in the trends there, but there is a lot now more focus, especially for philanthropic funding, on that consumer area, just because it feels like a gap. It's something that's probably not going to be addressed by private funders. It's tough to really point to, like, a profit motive of, like, change a consumer in some way. And so I think that that's been really like our shared perspective, in that philanthropy is probably going to be the one that fills the gap for now, and then hopefully that becomes something that other people can bear in terms of a burden. I wanted to ask Cyrus to go deeper into just what, let's say, the clients that you talk to that are looking to fund this space. What have they been asking? Like, what are they saying, like, in terms of, like, what are they looking at? And has that really changed over the past couple of years?
I don't think it's really changed, to be frank. I mean, first of all, for anyone who's spent much time in philanthropy, there's certainly no kind of blanket perspective for philanthropists. Each one comes with their own sort of posture and position on a topic. I have some clients who are most interested in being highly catalytic. So every dollar they invest, they want that to be advancing an initiative that would not advance without their support. And I have others that want to use impact investments to, bolster the impact of their overall portfolio, but not really risk principal in the same way that other catalytic funder did. So, there are a lot of different angles that philanthropists approach impact investing from. within that, I would say, the ones that want to be catalytic are probably taking the posture that Ida was referencing on sort of like initiatives and companies and business models that, require a little more nuance and storytelling to advance. And the other ones are still looking for like tech or tech-related opportunities, that kind of like sexy style venture portfolio that may have been romanced over the sort of last few years. But I would say that almost all of my clients that are foundations that are focused on impact investing in the food waste space are still sort of like sticking to those strategic plans that they put in place over the last few years and are still eager to deploy money, even if it is maybe there's a slightly higher bar.
Okay, that makes sense. Before we move on to sort of like the next session, hopefully this is working. Hello. Before we move on to the next part of like what we want to talk about, I wanted to ask both of you, do you find that recycling is something that's quite hard to fund from a philanthropic perspective? Just because that's what the data is telling me right now, is there's not much going there. And I guess I'll point it to
Yes.
To Ida first.
It's a challenge. I think, I'll also say that we have a stellar team, but we have a small team. So we've got Anne-Marie and Hannah in the front row. Love to shout them out. But recycling it requires a lot of expertise in that field, right? And, one of the challenging things about waste is that it is such a local problem. And so, or opportunity as well. So you really have to think about, what's going to work in Pittsburgh versus San Francisco. And so to scale these opportunities, it's really hard. And so there's a lot of very small kind of, your neighborhood compost collection, those really small opportunities. And then there's some big investment opportunities with, municipal compost facilities or any kind of waste haulage. And I think it's hard to find something in the middle where you're able to really scale up. That's not to say the solutions aren't out there, but I think for philanthropy, we haven't found the exact right place where we feel like we have a huge value add. And I think, we always want to look at where we're going to have the highest impact. And right now, we just haven't seen the exact opportunity for philanthropy. I think as an investment case, there is a ton of opportunity there. So not to say we'll never look at it.
Yeah.
The point about it being typically a local solution definitely resonates with what I see. I mean, the one area where I have seen quite a bit of really exciting, interesting activity is in packaging, which is oftentimes in a food adjacent category or unrelated, with kind of a 1 to 2 year pipeline to become more involved in the food sector. But I see very few recycling deals for my clients, but from an alternative packaging perspective, there's been probably like a 3 to 5 year cycle of really interesting, usually highly technical, sort of new company development.
And do you mind clarifying the packaging? Is it more like coatings on the things, or is it more like Tupperware type solutions?
Yeah, both. I mean, you've got companies that are creating bioplastics that can be used for single-use packaging, and you've got other companies that are developing safe linings to make things recyclable, and others that are using upcycled fibers for kind of alternatives for styrofoam. You've got a lot of different really interesting innovation. I mean, those are challenging industries with really, really cheap traditional incumbents that will be hard to compete with over the long term, but really important developments. And I think that's actually where the philanthropic funding that wants to be most catalytic is so important, because for almost all of these businesses, the moment that they're going to reach price parity with whatever sort of nasty petrochemical incumbent that exists is going to require pretty significant scale. And so they'll need really kind of dependable, patient sources of capital to get them there.
And one more comment on that, which is that I think the opportunity we see immediately in recycling is still on consumer education, because we all know if you build a great recycling process and no one knows how to do it, it doesn't really matter. So I think that's a great philanthropic opportunity as well, is how do we get that behavior change?
That makes a lot of sense. our data, like I know we're tracking where funding is going, but that helps us with the question of where it's not going. And so I want to ask both of you, what are gaps that you think remain unaddressed by philanthropic capital? Yeah, we can leave it there and then explore the question. So Cyrus, let's put you in the hot seat.
I mean, more than I think like narrowing on a specific area that feels like there's a gap, I think like the gap is a step above that. There are still probably a scary number of foundations and philanthropic entities that are not using impact investments to nearly their full potential. And there's a long list of reasons why that is, from kind of incentive structures around decision making and intergenerational differences and all sorts of reasons. But I would say more than a specific kind of subsector or area that doesn't get funding, I would say it's more about philanthropists still being on the sideline from an impact investing perspective that would probably fill most gaps, at least partially.
I think you outlined a couple of the big gaps, specifically in food waste, in the presentation. And I think, again, so we narrowed in on prevention solutions. And if you look at the data, and I know we're looking at basically a 3-year gap in philanthropic data because of the IRS. So if we're thinking, okay, 20 million run rate, and I think it was 0.8% is going to prevention, and if you multiply that by 8, because that's indirect funding, we're still looking at like around 15 million indirectly going to prevention solutions. And I just want to put it into context. Our RFP last year was $2.3 million in grants. We funded about over $3 million on food waste, and we had allocated $4 million. So when we talk about the gap between 2019 and 2023, like I can tell you where $4 million went last year, and that's compared to a run. I mean, I guess it's 20 million direct, and indirect is bigger, but there's money out there that's also, I think, like we as funders need to do better at sharing our data with what we're funding and connecting the dots of, yeah, we're funding Impact Justice that works in prison systems, and they're doing an awesome project on reducing food waste, right? Like that's a food waste grant for us. And beyond that, I think, we get super focused on where dollars are going, and we also have to keep in mind what is the impact and how are we measuring that? Where are we with actually reducing food waste? We were having a great conversation yesterday about how do we track, budget size of organizations working on this, because that's a sign of growth. I mean, we've been talking about how much the summit has grown, how many more people are here, how many people are in the room. So there's other things that we're looking at to kind of track progress that, the dollars going out as grants are one area, but there's certainly a lot more in the context of tracking it. And I also just want to call out, donor advised funds, which drive me crazy because you've got all this money just sitting somewhere and it's completely opaque and we have no idea where it's going, and that's intentionally there. So I think that there's a huge opportunity there. And again, that gets back to storytelling and connecting with funders and really making the case for this investment. And we're in this moment of urgency, right? I mean, there are so many reasons to be doing this right now and many motivating factors to get people on board. So I think that there are not only gaps, but like a lot of opportunities. And ReFed's been doing a great job with kind of de-risking some of those with the Catalytic Grant Fund, and bringing up some other organizations that need that initial kind of pilot funding. And once they're de-risked, a little bit, it's the same as venture capital, right? Some people just don't want to be the first person in the pool, but we need to make sure we have the line of people behind us to be like second and third.
Talking about risk, because I like that you brought that up. Do you think that explains why funding has ended up in certain spots? So you know how we looked at rescue getting a lot, but mostly like the established names. I'll ask it for both of you, but I think you probably have a view on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are naturally drawn to things you can measure. That's just human nature, and that makes sense. And so I think that's why we've seen so much interest in food recovery. It's tangible, we get it. And food recovery is super important. Like, I want to say that. We need food recovery. We also need people to get comfortable with thinking about funding things that might not work or might not work in the way you think. So with our cohort of grantees, we brought everyone together yesterday. And one of the coolest parts was we heard project updates, but we also heard about how different grantees had connected independently and supported each other's work. That wasn't something that when we asked grantees to submit a proposal and said, what are your outcomes? I didn't think that someone was going to be helping someone design a survey and get better questions on behavior around food waste, right? Like that is just a total unexpected win, right? And so when we think about risk in philanthropy, I think, there's a sense of pride and responsibility, right? You have a fiscal responsibility to make good decisions with funding. But I think we also need to get comfortable with accepting that, again, just like you would in a venture portfolio, some things are going to be huge successes and some things won't. And we love hearing about, oh, that was a failure. Why? And what did we learn from it? How do we share those learnings to everyone else so they don't make the same mistake? And so I think it's defining your risk tolerance, but also viewing risk as an opportunity and viewing progress as a collective movement, right? Maybe we're not going to fund the 3 best things that get us to that 50% waste reduction. But if us funding 10 projects and another foundation funding 10, and collectively, if we get there, like we did it, cool. So let's try and do that together.
I mean, I wish my clients had as mature a position as Ida did. I mean, for most of my clients, it's really that, some subsectors feel more scalable. There's been more M&A activity in them. They see a path to an exit or growth more clearly. Timeline to sustainability is shorter. There's sort of like a long list of, valid but not necessarily that interesting reasons why certain areas have gotten more funding. But risk plays a huge part, and I don't think the group of foundations that are willing to go, to deploy their impact investments into this like really catalytic category is that big. I mean, I think a lot are still really intent on trying to achieve market rate returns in their portfolio, which is a valid position to take and a valid strategy. But the number of those foundations that are willing to take such a long vision and collaborative approach to their investing is not huge.
That makes sense. And maybe a more like specific question. One area that we saw not getting a lot of funding, at least from like these larger foundations and the data, is initiatives that are more local. So again, pointing to that fact that I think both of you mentioned, food waste is a very local issue. How does that, I guess, like factor into your granting out? And do you think that's a problem that can be overcome with philanthropic dollars?
So you mean people aren't funding food waste locally?
Yeah, it becomes a little more difficult to fund, let's say, like that local composter that we're talking about. That ends up being more individual giving versus foundation giving. And it's almost harder to fund, let's say, like different geographic spots because the need is like there. It's significant need, but like unless you live there, it's tough to get your head around it, right?
Yeah, and philanthropy is also clustered, right? I mean, it's situated where people have resources, and so yeah, San Francisco is a great place to look for money. Maybe not these days, but generally, I think that is a huge issue, and we fund locally, statewide, nationally, internationally, right? Some foundations have a very specific mandate. I think most do, right? And that comes from having, a charter at some point. Some of those things can't be changed, but I think it is important. And again, I will fangirl about ReFed again. I think what's been really useful for us is being able to tap into a network where we can get visibility into what's happening in smaller organizations, and some of the re-granting work that ReFed did during COVID especially, I think was really critical. Because, for some of the local solutions, if you don't have philanthropy in your area, you just might not have anywhere to go to.
I mean, I don't know if I have a particularly astute perspective here other than, to find a foundation or a philanthropist that is going to fund a local food waste solution, you first need to take the universe of foundations and find one that's focused exclusively on that community, which will be kind of like a huge narrowing of that number. And then of that few group, you need to find one that's focused on food waste, or maybe sort of like agriculture and sustainability, and they'd be open to it. So I think unless you're in a pretty like well-established area of philanthropists, it's just a really hard sort of sell when there's great need across a lot of impact areas.
And so this session is feeling a little down, as you can tell. And so I don't want to leave it on that note. Let's make it a little more positive, and I'll leave that with here. What do you think is the appropriate role for philanthropy to play in food waste? And I'll start with, I guess, Ada, you go for it.
Sure. I think there's been a lot of talk today about de-risking, right? And funding things that, need that proof of concept and are not necessarily proven out to be a sure success story, right? And we need to be thinking more creatively. We need to be thinking outside the immediate networks that we have. And to me, that's fun. I mean, philanthropy is an opportunity to, have that catalytic capital that can do something that otherwise just wouldn't happen. And so I think the opportunity here is really storytelling, or that's the need, right? We have to get better at talking about the opportunity in a way that connects with people. And that's, I think, one of the reasons many of us are drawn to food waste as an issue in the first place. It's because you get it, it's tangible. Hopefully we're eating 3 meals a day. There's so many opportunities to talk about it, to engage with it. And so I think the role of philanthropy is to support not just the actual organizations, but also the people and the kind of the whole movement behind how we start to make progress in a way that isn't, that isn't just super iterative, right? Like, how do we start to leapfrog some of these initial steps and really get things moving and bring more people in? So the human capital part of it, I think, is super important, and that is something that philanthropy often has the luxury of being able to take a step back and pause and think about. I can view this kind of from a step removed from the work, and then support the people who are actually doing the work day to day. So the human side of it's super important as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would love for foundations to lean into their role as catalytic funders. And I think in general, I really encourage, certainly the foundations that I work with, but any others to just, try and, break the shackles of what we have kind of done traditionally. And, we talk about changing consumers' behavior to waste less food, but maybe we change philanthropists' behavior to, actually, take that next step and go from, thinking that impact investing is like an interesting intellectual exercise to actually deploying some capital and maybe hiring somebody to help them do it, and, really take a much more like active, front-footed position on deploying capital in every type of way, right? So whether that's grant capital to sort of service providers, to policy initiatives, to impact investments, there are all of these different highly impactful levers that philanthropists can use, and most of them go underutilized.
Digging into that, are you saying that there's probably that gap there that philanthropists need, sort of that, let's say, intervention by, let's say, an organization or a person?
I mean, they certainly could. I think that the challenge you have is that, like any decision maker, whether it's an executive director or a chief investment officer, is, not always incentivized to do something different. So if the, Alejandro Family Foundation wants to start, making impact investments, if the CIO decides to do that today and the portfolio doesn't go well, that CIO owns that decision. But if they don't, and they do what they've been doing forever, and markets go down, you say, well, markets went down. It went down for everybody. There's no sort of risk involved in that position. And it takes a little bravery from these decision makers who ultimately don't have a ton of accountability to say, this is the new way forward for the organization.
And one comment on that, I know we're supposed to be talking about super positive things, but I do want to talk about one other challenge, which is, this time last year we were talking about the closed loop fund. And I will just say, it's hard to get into as a foundation who's never done impact investing, there's a lot of education you have to do. And there's a lot of decision makers along that path. Making a grant, like that decision-making process, we know how to do it. We have a board meeting, the board votes. When you're thinking about impact investing, all of a sudden you're bringing in legal teams and your CFO, and you're asking questions that it's a completely different process. And so, it was disappointing when the closed loop fund wasn't able to move forward, because that was going to be a vehicle where it would make it easier for everyone else to do that. And I think the positive thing that came out of that for me is a lot of people still really want to do this. Like, there is that appetite out there, and we're trying to figure out not just how to do it, but how to do it in a more efficient way, so that more foundations, so it's like easier for the next person, right? And so I think that appetite is there among a few kind of forward-leaning foundations. And I'll say, just from like our personal experience working with our board and with our CFO, that's been a really interesting learning journey. They've been really curious about it. The first time we brought it up, they're like, what do you mean we can spend, put our grant dollars into a company? That doesn't make any sense, right? And so I think that it is changing. It's a lot of education, and it's a lot of seeing your peers doing similar things, so you don't feel like, oh, I'm the only one doing this, there must be something wrong. So I think, again, having partners who are working in this space, having ReFed as a thought leader, like, that's been super helpful for us.
Awesome. And so with that, first of all, I want to say thank you for coming, and please give a round of applause to our two amazing panelists. And we have a small amount of time, but a good amount of time for questions. Yeah.
Environmental grant makers, have they put anything about food waste on their agenda? I was just asking about the environmental grant makers, because I know they get together every year. Is food waste even on their radar screen?
That's a great question that I do not have the answer for.
Don't have the answer for it.
Thank you so much for this discussion. It's been really interesting. I appreciate the way that you broke out the funding by recovery and prevention and recycling. And I wonder, since we have food losses and waste throughout the supply chain, since we have massive spikes in consumer food loss and in agricultural production, in which direction did those funds flow when you look at the supply chain? Follow-on question, we need more funding in agricultural food loss prevention. Thank you.
Awesome. So in terms of that breakdown, that's a very good question. And unfortunately, I think what you just said there about agricultural food loss and waste is kind of the area that did get a little short shift, as one would say. In addition to that, I think people have a view that ag tech in general covers that and not necessarily food philanthropy, but I feel like that's a misconception. Where that money did skew towards was, again, like rescue, so that's going to be towards like the consumer side, retail, and then like a little bit in the manufacturing, but I would say it's more towards the end of the food supply chain, not the beginning.
I'm going to first share one quick question from our virtual audience, and then I'll bring the microphone over to the other side. But the question is, are there ways of bringing philanthropic organizations together strategically as partners so we can work together to fund the right concepts versus always having to adjust concepts for individual funder priorities?
You should sign up for the Food Waste Funder Circle. It's exactly what it's there for.
Thank you for the plug.
No, we really, I think that is something we actively try and do, is work with other funders. We don't need to recreate the wheel, right? And if there's something that's worked for someone, great. If there's a relationship there, we want to know about it. And also, I think there's an opportunity for pooled diligence. There's a number of initiatives working on that right now. ReFed has done some. CapShift does a lot with donor advised funds. If you ever want to look at that, very cool. So yeah.
So I don't know if this is ignorance, because it sounds like you have a food waste funders group, but have you convened foundations around this? And the reason I ask is, in the early 2000s, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation started convening foundations to talk about food systems, because at that point, only school gardens were getting funded. And so they actually helped gather stories and tell stories in convening foundations to help them understand it's a broad range of programs and projects that they should fund. The other is, I wasn't sure if you've ever reached out to councils of philanthropy. I'm from Connecticut. The Connecticut Council of Philanthropy helped us understand that only 3% of family foundation funds went to the environment, and none went for waste management. So we started a small foundation, not millions, small amounts. However, we do fund small projects related to recycling. But it was our understanding that there was no other programs like that in the country. Thanks.
And so that might also be a plug for the Food Waste Funder Circle again, to an extent. Like that's what our goal was in terms of funding this thing, so that we could get philanthropists who may not know this, like where to start, and then that they can be brought along the journey to see, like, okay, what are the issues that I feel strongly about that I can fund. And so we're doing sessions. Like, I know to an extent we focused a bit on the private side and a bit on the philanthropic side. And I think that's been a real goal for our team, to really focus on the philanthropic side, just because that need is there. And like what you just say, there's just so many people that want to get involved, and it's just where to start.
And one more comment on that, which I think is important, is that the Food Waste Founders Circle does for-profit and nonprofit investing. So it's also been a useful tool to have. I sit in a role where I do both. I sit in our family office, and so it's particularly useful for me. But I think it's great if you sit on one side of the aisle to be able to see the other side. And we're talking about systems change here. And so it's really critical to understand what philanthropy can do, and it's also important to look down the road and see what are we going towards, and how does what I'm funding now support the future of this initiative. And I'm not saying necessarily every initiative is a philanthropic grant that then turns into some venture deal, but to see that whole spectrum of what's out there, I think helps us all just keep the long-term vision in mind.
Thank you all so much for participating in the panel. It's been really interesting to hear all of your perspectives. I would love to know, for an organization seeking philanthropic funding, what recommendations would you have as far as storytelling and how they can engage to receive some of that funding?
I mean, I can sort of take that from an impact investment perspective. I don't know if it's a for-profit or a nonprofit, but if you're looking to sort of raise money, there are a number of different sort of places you can go. I mean, there's a kind of your organization needs to kind of figure out their identity, which will really help sort of figure out and direct which channel of fundraising you'll go down. Because there are plenty of great businesses that are not appropriate for venture capital, which is obviously a really kind of cool thing to do, I suppose. But there are appropriate lenders and family offices and foundations that have specific allocations to maybe below market lending or something that would be more appropriate. So I think the first step is to figure out what type of business either you are today or want to grow to become, and that will help kind of define what fundraising channel is most appropriate.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would say don't try and fit into what the funder wants to hear. It's not going to work. But be true to know what you're actually wanting to do, and I think that the story will tell itself, but don't try and fit yourself into a box.
So to kind of follow up on that question, as we're I'd say, small to mid-sized food rescue, how can we get the attention of funders that are so used to just funding Feeding America organizations, where we feel like we can have as much, if not more, of an impact, based on the funding?
I think it's important to acknowledge that all of these things need to exist. We need Feeding America, and we need food recovery, and we need prevention solutions. Like, all of them are going to exist together. So, and this is one opinion, right? I would tell the story of how, you work to complement each other and what specific gap you're filling. I think it's really important to say, this is our niche. This is what we're trying to do that's different than everyone else, and that's why it's separate. And I think, the pre-competitive has been the word of the day, right? We need to be thinking of how, again, we're like all doing this together. And so I always find it helpful. We make decisions largely based on relationships and getting to know our partners. We view these as investments. And so building those relationships are really important. And I think that's where the storytelling and the education of the whole system is useful.
Hey guys, thanks so much for joining today. My name's Jenny. I'm from Kava Mediterranean Grill, and I wanted to ask, have you seen corporate foundations doing anything interesting or anything in this space?
As a sort of regular Kava consumer, I can say, yeah, kind of. There are, there was a time maybe like 5 or 6 years ago where more than corporate foundations, you had sort of corporate VCs getting established that sort of seemed like they were like M&A pipeline tools or engines more than anything else, but were certainly doing highly impactful work. I think the commitments for corporate philanthropy are still coming, but are typically fairly vanilla. I wouldn't say that those are like the most catalytic, most sort of like on the vanguard of solving issues. And I think most of the reason is because they view, they have this sort of stakeholder accountability framework that is very different from what a smaller or family foundation or family philanthropist can do, and that makes it harder, at least in my experience.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sam with the Global Food Banking Network. It's easier to find a funder that's focused on food systems, on food security, increasingly on environment. And I'm kind of interested in, maybe from Ida, like why was this a focus or one of the focus areas of the foundation? And Cyrus, maybe have you seen like the journeys of any of the foundations that you work on that focus on those other issues, and they have been able to migrate over to food loss and waste, or have seen that as a part of a portfolio that might not be named that way?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I started working on food waste probably 8 years ago, and that's when ReFed really just started. And for me, it's been just something that I immediately latched onto for, I think, many of the reasons that will resonate with all of you. It's tangible. It's something we can do now. I originally approached it from a climate perspective and then realized it's the best way to solve the climate without talking about the climate. And I think we need to be doing more of that. And then you think about all the co-benefits, whether it's health, nutrition, kind of the social, kind of human dignity aspect of it, right? It's food. And again, I'll harp back to storytelling. I think it's so important and it's so compelling to be able to talk about food waste as something that we can do now. Like, this is a solution that's there today. And, I have an engineering degree, and even when I start to think about electric vehicles and carbon sequestration, I know it's there and the technology exists. I don't really fully get it, right? With food, I get it. And so with our foundation, I was the one who has been championing this work and, being the food waste evangelist. And, our office is now, I'm the person who will be, if we have lunch, making sure that every piece of pizza is taken home, right? And so part of that is even just internal behavior change of starting to talk about it. And I'll give one tangible example. So I used to work at the Pisces Foundation in San Francisco. As part of our portfolio, 3 different program areas, climate was one. Within that, we had maybe 2 grants on food waste, so a tiny, tiny, tiny portion of it. And I would always do the food for our board meetings. And even when we didn't have food waste grants on the docket, like, I would get banana snacks, I would get regrained bars, and that would be the snacks for the day because it was a talking point, right? And so trying to find those points where you can start the conversation in a way that isn't kind of as, aggressive, or you need to be doing this. It's just, hey, like, did you enjoy eating that? Let's talk about it. And so I think some of those softer entry points where you kind of are approaching it with a more curious mindset of, there's 20 ways I could connect you to this topic. Let me kind of feel around and figure out what resonates for you.
Briefly, I don't have any clients actually that are focused singularly on food waste. They are all sort of taking a food systems approach, and they will have sub-verticals related to that. And almost all of them get to food systems from initially a climate perspective. So, a lot, as idiosyncratic as it sounds, depends on who the kind of like program officer, investment officer is working on that topic to kind of figure out what subcategories under these pretty big umbrellas end up getting more attention.
Alejandro, have you considered including government funding in your model? There is more funding available now for food waste. I'd be curious to know how much it might, some of it's significant in dollar terms, not that there's many opportunities. I'd be interested to know how it might skew the need, close the gap.
Thank you for the question, and absolutely. It almost feels like you're here as an ad for the capital tracker. So we're hoping to, add that data towards the end of the year. We're working, our team, myself, Caroline, Alex over there, just sifting through the federal data so that hopefully we can present that story too. But yeah, look for it. End of year is our target, but we'll see.
I guess just a question observation in thinking about that too and seeing, I work in the recycling space. We're an organic waste hauler based in Rhode Island. I wonder if one of the challenges there is a lot of the recyclers, whether it's compost or haulers, those would be for-profit businesses. A lot of the food rescue, food donation tend to be nonprofits. So I wonder if the overlay of that is there's an ease in terms of some of those in terms of IRS structure naturally fit into philanthropy. And so that's where the funding tends to go. Whereas our experience, I've worked in nonprofits for over a decade, was the impact investing and starting to get into things that start bringing lawyers and CFOs. Then a lot of family foundations are just sort of like, I'm going to wait and see. I don't want to touch this, or this gets us into a legally gray zone that I'm not comfortable with. And just wondering if that's, as an overlay, does that jive with what you're seeing? Like the IRS structure actually is somewhat limiting where funding is going, not out of lack of interest, but actually out of sort of eligibility.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent that's true. And, we're not going to change the IRS, right? So it's how do we operate in that environment? But I think you're right. And I also think about what types of financing are applicable for whatever solution you're looking at. And so, yeah, is that more of a debt opportunity rather than looking at, a lot of impact investing is also, I'd say generally, Cyrus can answer this better than I can, but generally you're looking more at the kind of equity growth opportunities. And then there's some specific family offices, foundations that focus on debt. And I think that's actually that's another huge opportunity. I was recently met someone whose entire family office was just doing impact investing via debt. And that is, I think we should grow that space as well.
Hi, I'm Gary Oppenheimer from Ample Harvest, Oregon. I applaud and I'm thrilled that you're talking about looking at innovative solutions to fund, but I would just ask that you look at also changes in metrics we're expected to supply. Food waste prevention programs can't supply the same type of metrics that food recovery programs do. It's been a real challenge for us to answer a question that doesn't apply to us.
Agreed, and I'll say we're working with our cohort of grantees right now to develop those metrics, and we had a workshop in the fall where we were asking them, help us figure out how we measure this, because we know it's a little hard to say tons diverted when you're thinking about that prevention step. So absolutely.
Awesome. Well, everybody, thank you for joining today. That's the end of the session.